Still writing medical records manually? Imagine reducing the mental load of a full day's patient care. With ScribeNote, the AI-powered veterinary soap creator, you can streamline record keeping effortlessly as if you had a personal scribe. I recently used ScribeNote during a hectic string of emergency shifts when I managed over 20 cases in 12-hour days. It drastically cut down my medical record completion time, letting me focus more on patient care and less on paperwork. ScribeNote has truly transformed my workflow. Born from a desire to help, ScribeNote now supports veterinary clinics across North America. It is dedicated to improving veterinary wellness and reducing burnout. Try it now at scribenote.com with a free trial of 50 records. For Reviving Vet Med listeners, use the link in the show notes for 100 free notes, 50 more than the trial. Book a no-obligation demo call and see how ScribeNote can simplify your day. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Reviving Vet Med. In today's episode, we're addressing a critical and sensitive topic, supporting veterinary team members through suicide. If you or anyone you know are struggling with thoughts of suicide or self-harm, please call 988. Given that September is Suicide Prevention Month, I thought it would be a good time to review these important topics. Today, we'll cover the AVMA toolkits and resources for suicide prevention and dealing with the aftermath of a suicide. Critical Incident Stress Debriefing and suicide prevention training will also briefly be discussed. This is a conversation that's both challenging and essential, and I'm grateful you're here to explore it with me. With that said, let's go ahead and get into the episode.
This is the Reviving Vet Med podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Marie Hollowaychuk. And my mission is to improve the mental health and well-being of veterinary professionals around the world.
We know that veterinary professionals face immense stress and pressure, which can sometimes lead to severe mental health struggles. Recognizing this, several organizations such as the American Vet Med Association or the AVMA and the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges or the AAVMC have developed invaluable resources to support those in veterinary medicine who may be experiencing such crises. Today, in honor of September being Suicide Prevention Month, I am going to dive into some of these latest resources available for suicide prevention and support. So the first document that I want to talk about is the AVMA after a suicide. And there's actually two documents that are available. And these documents provide detailed guidance on how to manage the aftermath of a suicide within a veterinary practice and also at a veterinary teaching hospital or a vet school. They cover really important topics like how to communicate with the team or with the students, how to address grief, and how to maintain a supportive work environment during these extraordinarily difficult times. The AVMA emphasizes the importance of addressing the emotional needs of everybody who is involved and also implementing strategies to prevent further crises in the future. So I'm going to link to all of these documents in the show notes, and I'm going to first just go through a little bit of what the Toolkit for Colleges of Veterinary Medicine includes. I want to highlight that these documents were put together by many, many different individuals. There were team members within the AVMA, including Dr. Jen Brandt, the Director of Wellbeing and Diversity Initiatives, who is also a licensed social worker, and others as well within some of the different veterinary medical colleges and those involved with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So the beginning of the document provides an at-a-glance page that just breaks things down into first getting the facts about what has happened, informing the emergency contact person or the family member, sharing the news with the wider veterinary school community, helping students cope, and then planning for some sort of memorialization. And what I love about this document is just how practical and tangible the document is. There is an appendix that includes checklists with regards to the communication, sample scripts to be used in face-to-face or email notifications, a checklist for planning a memorial service, and sample statements to use with anybody from the media that may be contacting the school for information. And I think the important thing that the AVMA did when they constructed this document was to make sure that everything included in this document would help to prevent suicide contagion. So I've talked about this in the podcast before, and I'll link to one of my previous episodes, which talked about the safety that is needed when we talk about suicide in the veterinary space. And the reason that we need to be safe about how we talk about suicide is because there is a very well-documented phenomenon that can happen in which when people are exposed to learning about a suicide or when they're impacted by suicide, talking about that suicide or being exposed to information about the suicide can put them at higher risk of future suicides themselves. So one of the big pieces of this document as well includes how to mobilize a crisis response team. So they talk about who should be on the crisis response team, how often they should be meeting, and what they should be doing within the first days after the suicide, and then in the weeks to follow and beyond that first month as well. So again, I can't stress this enough, how comprehensive this document is and just how practical it is in terms of putting these recommended steps into action. So the other After a Suicide Toolkit that the AVMA put together is a guide for veterinary workplaces. And once again, there were a lot of contributors to this document. There were similar individuals from the American Vet Med Association, including Dr. Jen Brandt, as well as individuals from other communities, including the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the North American Vet Tech Association Wellbeing Task Force. So there was a lot of individuals that worked together to create this document that helps lead individuals in any veterinary workplace through the immediate steps after a suicide, so days 1 through 4, then those short-term steps in the first 4 weeks after a suicide, and then beyond the first month in terms of tools and templates and tasks that they recommend. So of course, in those early stages, the recommendations focus on getting the facts around what's happened and then initiating some sort of crisis response, which really involves making sure that the team is effectively communicated to and that they have crisis supports available. They also address communicating with the practices or the workplace's community. So that might be their clients or other people whom they work with. And then being mindful of cultural diversity and the wishes of the family. So one of the big things that is talked about in both of these AVMA documents is just making sure that the family's wishes are taken into consideration when it comes to disclosing the suicide. It is definitely recommended that ideally we would be disclosing that the individual has died by suicide to help reduce any stigma around talking about suicide, being open about that. Definitely not necessarily wanting to disclose a lot of great detail about the suicide itself, but to be clear that this individual did die by suicide and that suicide is extremely complex. So one of the nice things about this document as well is that once again, they give scripts and strategies for how to talk to the family, for how then to communicate that to the team and to the community. And they've got different templates and things that can be used to do that. When it comes to short-term steps during those first 4 weeks, there's a lot of emphasis in the document on how to support the staff, how to have open conversations, how to check in, what resources to provide, and also how to work with the media. So whether that's sharing some of this information via the practice or organization's social media page or what other strategies might be used. Certainly if it's a small community, there might be mass media as well that is contacting the practice. And then beyond that first month, there is discussion about that memorialization and how we can engage in suicide prevention and mental health awareness strategies. So ideally, we would come together as a workplace to take collective action, whether it's volunteering, making a donation, engaging in a suicide prevention program, or doing something else to honor this team member that has died. Now, one of the key things that they do talk about when it comes to memorialization is that you do want to make sure that you are memorializing this team member in the same way that you would memorialize any of your team members that died for any reason. So we want to make sure that, if we had a team member, for example, that died of cancer and we were to have some sort of memorial or have some sort of celebration of life for them, that we would do the same thing for an individual that died by suicide, so that there is no disparity there. And again, that is all in the name of helping to reduce suicide contagion and to reduce stigma around suicide. So once again, there's tools and templates in terms of sample scripts, sample electronic communications, key messages for the media, and then just tips in general for talking about suicide. We want to make sure always when we're talking about suicide that we're using language that is correct. We want to make sure that we're avoiding any stigmatizing language, that we're giving accurate information about suicide, being very clear that in most cases, there is an underlying mental health condition such as suicide, substance use, or other forms of mental health problems, and that we are not focusing on the method or graphic details of the suicide, nor are we glorifying the suicide. We always want to promote help seeking, and we do that by communicating that help is available. Seeking help is a sign of strength. And then, of course, giving numbers for people to talk to or to call. We also want to make sure that while it's common for people to ask the question, why, when a person dies by suicide, that we want to make sure that we're not oversimplifying this or we're not placing blame on clients or situations or other things. It's incredibly complex, and it's not for us to say, what the reason was for this individual's suicide. And then, of course, addressing feelings of responsibility. I think, in my conversations with team members and practice owners who have been impacted by a team member's suicide, there's a lot of feeling of responsibility in terms of, could we have done something to prevent this? Or was there something that we did that might have contributed? And it's important to remember that suicide is nobody's fault. And we can't always predict that a person is going to die by suicide, especially individuals who are in distress, just like our pets and animals can do a great deal to hide their distress. So can individuals as well. So again, I will share the links to both of these documents in the show notes and highly, highly recommend checking those out. So next, I want to talk about another document from the AVMA, which is the Suicide Prevention Toolkit. So this document is crucial for those proactive measures in talking about and preventing suicide. It talks about strategies and best practices for suicide prevention within veterinary settings, from creating a supportive work culture to recognizing the early warning signs of suicide. I think that this document is perfect in light of September being Suicide Prevention Month, because this will equip veterinary practices with actionable steps to address mental health issues before they escalate to potential suicide. So this particular document, it's not a long document. It's about 20 pages long, but the crux of the document is really about 10 pages in terms of covering what leads to suicide and how can we prevent suicide. Other than that, there's a lot of resources and organizations that are linked to, as well as references. But really, the key components are really making sure that, we're dispelling any myths or misconceptions about what causes suicide and what are protective factors when it comes to suicide. So yes, there are risk factors that we are all well aware of, and there are also protective factors as well. So how do we promote those in the veterinary community? Importantly, the document also covers warning signs for suicide. They talk about things that people may be saying, things that people may be doing, and also different moods or changes in individuals' moods that might be contributing. And then the latter portion of the document is on preventing suicide. So while there is not one single cause for suicide, there's also not one single prevention to stop suicide, but there's many different things that we can do in terms of strengthening community supports, making sure that there is access to mental health services, certainly creating protective environments, promoting connectedness within our veterinary communities, teaching coping and problem-solving skills, identifying and supporting people who are at risk, and then lessening any harms and preventing future risks. And a lot of that is what we do after a suicide happens. Now, they give a lot of information on each one of these different strategies, and there are lots of links to click to with further resources. So again, this is a jam-packed document that I highly, highly recommend that everyone get their hands on. And another valuable resource is the AAVMC Suicide Prevention Awareness Toolkit. And this toolkit came out a few years before the AVMA Suicide Prevention document. There is some overlap in what these toolkits provide, This one was developed by the American Association for Veterinary Medical Colleges and provides a really comprehensive educational document with strategies tailored specifically for vet schools and training programs. And it's really aimed, once again, to enhance awareness of suicide, promote resilience, and implement effective prevention strategies in the academic setting, of course, where our future veterinarians are residing. And so this is another really great document, once again, and it talks a lot about communication. And that's one of the things I love about this document. It talks about safe communication. How should we be talking about suicide? What are the things that we want to say? And what are some of the things that we sometimes say that can be harmful? How can we avoid those? They also share some really, really great points that help to dispel misconceptions around suicide. So they talk about the importance of sharing the most recent stats when it comes to suicide. You know, a lot of people share stats that are incorrect about how much more likely vets are to die by suicide compared to the general population. So we want to ensure that people are referring to the correct statistics and they're not inflating what those numbers are. They also highlight a really important point that's come out over the last few years of research, which is recognizing that poisoning is the most common cause of death among veterinarians, and it's typically poisoning by pentobarbital. In fact, when we take away the veterinarians who have died by pentobarbital poisoning from our suicide studies, the rates of suicide among male and female vets and the general population are actually the same. So what this tells us is that the access to pentobarbital may be one of the key factors contributing to the problem of suicide among veterinarians. Now, this same statistic is not true for veterinary technicians and technologists or nurses. More often, they are dying from opioid poisoning compared to veterinarians. So some other really important information included in here are webinars with information to share with teams, how to identify someone at risk, and encouraging help-seeking behaviors, what that looks like, different social media movements, highlighting suicide prevention awareness, and sharing resources on suicide prevention and how to go about doing that in the veterinary community. So again, a really great document here, especially for those of you who are working in the academic space. Highly recommend accessing this document. Finally, I want to talk about critical incident stress debriefing. So this is a technique that is a structured approach to managing the psychological impact of any traumatic event, including the suicide of a colleague or team member. And CISD involves a series of meetings or one meeting led by trained professionals where affected individuals can share their experiences. They also, through facilitation by the person leading the session, can process their emotions and receive support. So this is a structured tool that has a lot of value for helping teams recover and regain a sense of normalcy after a traumatic event, such as a team member suicide. So I bring this up because a lot of practices and organizations have access to group insurance, or they have access to employee and family assistance programs. And a lot of the times those insurance programs or EAP or EFAP programs will cover a CISD. So I want to make sure that, again, when you're thinking about tools and strategies for recovering from a team member suicide, you want to think about whether or not it could be possible to host a critical incident stress debriefing at your practice or with your organization. Again, I know just from experience that the Canadian Vet Med Association is aligned with Western Financial, for example, who offers group insurance to CVMA members. And Western Financial offers a critical incident stress debriefing to any veterinary practice or organization or workplace who has their insurance program. So really important to think about these things. Again, in the heat of the moment when we're dealing with the aftermath of a suicide, we often forget some of these strategies, which is why at the end of the day, it is so important to think proactively. None of us ever want to imagine going through a team member suicide, and knowing that this is a risk for us, no matter what workplace we are in, and perhaps especially in the veterinary environment, we want to make sure that we are planning ahead and just making sure that we've got these resources if and when we were to need them. And last but not least, I'm going to leave you with a recommendation, if you have not already done so, to go through the QPR training that is free of charge. It's 60 minutes of a virtual training, and it's available on the American Vet Med Association website. QPR training is a gatekeeper suicide prevention training. It stands for Question, Persuade, Refer, and anybody can take it. This is a training that any human being can take to become more equipped to be able to identify people at risk of suicide, to ask the right questions, and to persuade them to get the help that they need. So again, I'll link to that in the show notes, but if you have not gone ahead and done that training, I highly recommend that you do that, and that you also consider recommending that your entire team complete that training as well. And again, what better time to do it than in September for Suicide Prevention Month? So as we navigate these challenging conversations, remember that seeking help and using any of these resources is a sign of strength. Nobody should have to face these struggles alone. And I know that if we work together collectively, we can make a big difference in improving mental health support within the veterinary profession. So please, I encourage you to explore these resources and think about how you can implement their strategies in your practice or in your educational setting. If you have any questions or need additional support, please reach out to these organizations or seek professional help. And of course, if you or anyone you know are having thoughts of suicide or self-harm, I encourage you to contact 988. You are not alone. Help is available. And with the right support, you can get through this. So that's it for this episode of Reviving Vet Med. I hope that you took away some helpful resources related to the heavy topic of suicide in our profession. If you do one thing after listening to this episode, I hope that it's to forward it to a colleague or coworker who you think would benefit. As well, we would appreciate if you would subscribe to the podcast so that you're sure to get the new episodes as soon as they drop. If you're interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's episode, please check out the show notes. You can also find us on social media at Reviving Vet Med for more tips and strategies for well-being in vet medicine. And if you have questions about today's episode, suggestions for future topics, or inquiries about sponsorship, please email us at podcast@revivingvetmed.com. I'd like to thank Asia and her team at Bear Beat Productions for producing this episode, and I'd also like to thank you for listening. I hope you'll tune in next time. In the meantime, take care of yourself.